Good morning and welcome to the new edition of Dr.Lamba's Awakening. I remember it was way back in 1956 and I was meeting the Prime Minister of India prior to my departure to Egypt as his personal nominee. And in our talks, I said, Sir, I agree to all your policies, but this concept of non alignment troubles me. How can you be non aligned between white and the black, between evil and the good? Non-alignment essentially means incapability to take decisive actions and stand by what's right. And it's a precursor to letting the evil forces win. My statement of that day has not changed even today. And when there are two opposing forces, it's very important to be clear whom you support. Keeping a healthy relationship with two opposing forces is walking a tight rope, and there's always a danger of falling down. Israel and Palestine, the conjoined twins as they were supposed to be, are enemies, mortal enemies. They may not say, at least Israel doesn't say, that they don't want other party, but Hamas is very clear that they want the annihilation and want to wipe out, basically, Israel from the face of the world. What's India doing? I was shocked to hear the statement of India at United States Security Council meeting, which apparently was seeking a balance between its old ties with Palestine and growing relationship with Israel, tracing India's tightrope walk in the decades shows how India has been very ambivalent. Now, coming to the latest one on Monday, 3 weeks back, Indian permanent representative United Nations made a very carefully crafted statement, and he strives to maintain a balance between India's historic ties with Palestine and blooming relations with Israel. But implicitly, he held Israel responsible for triggering the current cycle of violence, locating its beginning in the East Jerusalem rather than from Gaza. The request that from both sides refrain from attempts to unity change the existing status quo, including in Jerusalem, seems to be a message to Israel alone about its settlers' policy. This statement was also emphatic that the historic status quo of the holy places of Jerusalem, including Al Sharif, Temple Mount, must be respected. The site is at present administered by Jordan, is revered by both Islam and Judaism, but the Jewish worshippers are not allowed inside, and they often try to enter forcibly. This balance was evident in the pointed condemnation of indiscriminate rocket firing from Gaza on civilian targets in Israel, but not of the Israel strikes inside Gaza. This was possibly the first time that there was omission since 2017 of any reference to East Jerusalem as capital of a Palestinian state. And one thing was very good, which I loved. They hyphenated Haram al Sharif and Mental Mount, claimed by both Israel and Palestine, so they equated them. Now, India's policy on the longest running conflict in the world, it has been running for the last 70 years, has gone from changed. I don't deny it has changed from very, very unequivocally pro Palestine for the first 40 years tense balancing act in the 30 years after that. And in recent years, they are perceived as pro-Israel. Now, imagine from narrow to raw, if we see, the balancing began with India's decision to normalize relations with Israel in 1992. And it came against the backdrop of breakup of Soviet Russia, massive shift in the geopolitics of West Asia on account of the first Gulf War of 1990. That year, Palestinian Liberation Organization lost much of its clout. Then Indian embassy was opened in Tel Aviv in January 1992, and it marked an end to the 40 years of not recognizing Israel. Though we had recognized the country way back in 1950, but we had no full diplomatic ties. And Jawaharlal Nehru's reasoning was the decision to recognize Israel was an established fact, and he did so. But as I said, there was only one consul general, no ambassador, and that was in Bombay. It was established in 1953. And then later on in 82, it was shut down because the consul general criticized India's foreign policy. And it was allowed to reopen only after 6 months. India became free in 1947, and in 1948, India was the only non-Arab country that voted against the UN partition plan of Palestine that created Israel. I feel this was possibly because India's own partition along the religious lines had been a shock to Indian leaders, and they didn't want possibly that shock to be with the other countries. And secondly, they wanted to show the solidarity with the Palestinian people to ward off Pakistan plans to isolate India over Kashmir. And then India's dependence on the Arab countries became a factor. And also the large Indian Muslim population. The relationship with Palestine was an article of faith. At 53rd UN session, India co-sponsored draft resolution on the rights of the Palestinians of self-determination. 67 to 73. India lashed out at Israel as aggressor, and it supported Yasser Arafat. India was the first non-Arab country to recognize PLO, and they were invited to open an office. 5 years passed. This political office was converted into an embassy. It was full-fledged diplomatic status was given to PLO. And then when Arafat came, he was received at Hazard statement. 4 years passed, Narasimha Rao came, and then he made it turn around and we opened an embassy in Tel Aviv. And that was a shock to PL. However, while the friendship with Israel started way back in 1974, Mrs. Gandhi had met Golda Meir. This fact is not known. It was a very secretive meeting in England. Mrs. Gandhi had visited England, and we had a meeting with Golda Meir, Margaret Thatcher, and Mrs. Gandhi. One of the most hush-hush meetings. And then, as a result of that meeting, National Research Development Corporation in India, NRDC, took birth and started working on research. So it was a technical collaboration that began. Now, after 2014, when the first embassy was set up in Tel Aviv, our relations dealt with defense, science, technology, but India never accepted or openly acknowledged the relationship. They'll keep on getting the benefits. but never they openly said we are pro-Israel. And even now they don't say we are pro-Israel. They say we want equity. We want both to be successful. Like that, very, very wishy-washy sort of thing. And when Atal Bihari became the prime minister, Israel is Hindutva's ideal of a strong state that deals firmly with terrorists. And Israel, that's why, is looked with love and respect in India. Advani was the first Indian minister to visit Israel in 2000, and Jaswant Singh also visited the same year as foreign minister. And then they set up a joint anti-terror commission. Now, this was first time that India set up an anti-terror action group with Israel, and that was very helpful. As a result, Israel has been helping India in Kargil and even this year. Modi has taken full ownership of relationship with Israel, and the first indication was that India did not oppose but absented at the UN Human Rights Commission, which condemned Israel. This abstention was conspicuous because in 2014, in the time of Manmohan Singh, India had voted for a resolution against Israel. So in 2016, India abstained again. But the big change was the historic city that both Israel and they claim. Now, as I have been saying, India has been having a adopting a very balancing act. They have dehyphenated now. In 2017 at UNESCO, India voted in favor of a General Assembly opposing the Trump recognition of Jerusalem. This was the most undiplomatic action on the part of India, and it did disturb Israel. Though, of course, it made the Palestinians happy. But then we have not to forget that the interest of India lie in supporting Israel, especially now when India supporters like UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia are supporting Israel. So India can very easily satisfy the local population and say, okay, if they are supporting, why should we not support? In February this year, International Criminal Court claimed jurisdiction to investigate human rights abuses. And imagine the biggest perpetrators are Hamas. They put children as a shield, they put women as a shield, and then they attack civilians. While when Israel attacks, it gives a prior notice, throws leaflets, and ensures that as far as possible, civilians should not suffer. And yet they have condemned Israel and not Hamas. I know that Prime Minister Netanyahu sent personal message and wanted India to take a stand on the issue. And he was practically shocked that India's support was not there. And now one thing more, India doesn't recognize ICC and still it supported Palestine and the proposal. This was the most, I wouldn't call it stupid, but it was extremely undiplomatic. Now, the latest statement I referred to in the beginning is no different. It's not pro-Palestine, but it did not please Israel even. See, that's the stupidity of non-alignment. You don't make anybody happy. If India was to openly come in favor of Israel, it would be clear that they stand by the friend who is standing by them. But by saying you are doing this wrong and you are doing this wrong, you are not doing it. Now, let's be very clear. India, as I said, was the first non Arabic country to recognize. I don't mind it, let them recognize. But that does not mean that you should not call a spade a spade. There was a comment yesterday when I said that I'll talk on India, Israel, and Palestine. That why India? But it was by Mr. Singh Jaspal of Mississauga. And that, let me tell you, Indians suffer from a very extremely ambivalent attitude. That ambivalent attitude shows that India cannot cut its policy very clearly, even when it was enemy of fighting a war with China. It said, we want to maintain peace. You have got to say very clearly, if the axis of evil is there, this is evil and this will not be tolerated. You cannot have it both ways. If you want to have it both ways, then you are going to suffer. And in that case, you should not regret if the other party does not support you. Now, as far as Israel is concerned, we want to take their help in missiles. We want their iron domes. We want their capabilities to face the terrorists. But we are not willing to openly say that they are being terrorized by Palestine. And this attitude is basically not appropriate. The comment of Singh Jaspal was very pertinent. And he said, how long and old has been India's friendship with Palestine and what good has it served vis-a-vis India's age-old relations with Israel? Now, as I said, India in the beginning was not friendly to Israel. It did not even recognize. And when it recognized, it did not allow Israel to open an embassy. But Palestine, which was not even a state, they give them full diplomatic status. So the next part of the question was why India shuns away openly siding with Israel internationally. Any particular reason or disadvantage? The only reason is that India does not want to provide a handle to Pakistan to organize opposition to India in OIC. But as I said, this is no longer relevant because Egypt has signed a peace agreement with Israel, Jordan has a peace agreement with Israel, Syria has a peace agreement with Israel, and now Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Bahrain have diplomatic relations with Israel. So, with that huge group of Muslim countries having diplomatic full relations, there should be no hesitation on the part of India to openly side with Israel. Secondly, charity begins at home. It's only Israel which can help India. And Israel gave help to India in drip irrigation. It gave help to India in missiles. It gave help to India in biotechnology. It gave help to India in protective policies. So if you're getting help, acknowledge it. There are four sectors in India which are receiving extreme help from Israel, and yet we feel shy. Secondly, the local population, we are not oppressing Muslims by siding with Israel. Because now imagine, in Israeli army, there are more than 100,000 Muslims. They're fighting the Palestinians. So what's the problem in India? This is basically a diplomatic myopia which afflicts the politicians. Now, let me be very clear. The bureaucracy is all in favor of having an all-out relationship with Israel, which the political leadership doesn't want. The present leadership is inclined to do it, and that's why we have seen a gradual change towards Israel. But we are still not vocal enough, and we should be vocal enough. We should realize where our interest lies. Our national interest is of the prime importance, not what the others think. Others would always be critical, ignore them. So India, which has been shifting its policies, should be very clear that Palestinians welcome to exist. Sure, they have every right to this, but they have no right to send rockets into another country and take billions of dollars to purchase rockets, not to upgrade the lives of the people. No. So India should understand that the same people who attack India as terrorists are the people trained by the same organization who are attacking Israel. The commonality of the interest should make them work together. And India should tell Palestine, sit down, talk to Israel, be sensible, and stop all this talk of killing Jews or wiping Israel off the map of the world. That way lies even possibly the salvation of that part of the world. But most importantly, India would have a clear cut moral and political victory in that case. Thank you.